Welcome. It's really wonderful to see so many people here on such an inclement day. A little worried we might have to cancel or people couldn't get here, but obviously these are those were well-founded concerns. So thank you for coming. I'm Jeff Kahn. I am director of the Berman Institute, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all and introducing our speaker today for our bi-weekly seminar series. So as you see behind me, our speaker today is Alex London. Professor London is the Clara L. West Professor of Ethics and Philosophy and Director of the Center for Ethics and Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. I have a long history, actually, with Alex, or he and I have a long history together in that prior to his becoming a well-known endowed professor of philosophy and director of an ethics center, he was a postdoctoral fellow with me at the Center for Bioethics at the University of Minnesota a long time ago. So I'll take credit and no blame, right, for your success. And we knew you then, but we also knew that you would become this when you were with us. Maybe we didn't tell you that, but we did see it. So we're really happy to have Alex here today. He's, as I say, a longtime friend and colleague, and he's working in really interesting areas, which, as you see from behind me and on the slide, include ethics and autonomous vehicles. More generally, he works on biotechnology, artificial intelligence, methodological issues in theoretical and practical ethics, and on cross-national issues of justice and fairness. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Alex to Johns Hopkins and to our seminar today. He'll talk for about 45 minutes and then leave time for Q&A discussion with the group. So please join me in welcoming Alex.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. And so it's really an honor to be here and see so many old friends and new faces. It's odd to be introduced by somebody who knew me what is now 20 years ago. It's hard for me to think I've been doing so.
I wasn't going to tell him how long.
I know. When I was just in Japan, and when they introduced me, they mentioned that my dissertation was on Plato, and I was like, oh my God, right? I had a dissertation on Plato. Okay, so I'm going to talk about ethical and regulatory issues with autonomous vehicles. Part of my disclosure is that some of the content of this talk is based on joint work with my colleague David Danks. I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I will mention a couple of systems in the course of the talk, and mentioning them is not a endorsement by any means. Okay, so I'd like to have a little bit of audience participation. Can you call out the names of some of the systems on the slide? You recognize any of them?
Terminator.
Yes. Okay, good. HAL, Terminator. This is some of the kids are like, what? Like, what is that? Right? Come on, that's like War Games, the Whopper. I rely on Hollywood for my sort of futurism stuff. So I'm not a futurist. So my goal is not to prognosticate about what's likely to happen or not likely to happen. I think Hollywood does a far better job of that than I could. But our public discourse about artificial intelligence vacillates between two poles. One of them is the sort of the AI dystopia. Those are these images. The police robots from Elysium on the bottom right, if you haven't seen that movie, really very compelling picture of something that's a technology that's probably very likely in somebody's design pocket right now. But for autonomous vehicles, the dystopian picture translates into this, which I'm not really going to spend my time talking about. I'll tell you why I don't talk about trolleys. But so the dystopian question is, hey, we got to figure out how AVs are going to decide who to kill. And the trolley problem lives in a BSL-4 facility in philosophy departments, and then it sort of escaped. And autonomous vehicles is the discourse where everybody wants to talk about the trolley problem. I'll tell you why I'm not a big fan of that in a minute. The other pole is AI utopia. So you got WALL-E and Eve and the Star Wars robots that have compassion and humor and all these other sorts of things. And The utopian picture of AI when it comes to autonomous vehicles is the promise that we're going to be able to reduce the 33,000 annual road fatalities due to the current system that we allow on the road, which tends to drive while texting, eating, you know, and fiddling with the radio and all kinds of other things. So the idea is, if we can just perfect this technology, we're going to make the roads a safer place. We're going to save a lot of lives. And if you think about it that way, then you have to start asking, how frequently is the trolley problem going to arise? And you know, if in fact it arises more frequently with humans than it does with autonomous vehicles, then it probably doesn't matter how you solve it. From a public health standpoint, you'd be better off with people riding in that system than not, if in fact we can make this a reality and we can perfect this technology to the point where it actually does make the roads a safer place. So I actually don't know who this person is. I just saw this on Twitter, you know, but I like the idea that from that standpoint then, from the utopian standpoint, then the decision to use autonomous vehicles or not is itself a kind of trolley, because you've got all the people lined up on the one track who are killed on the roads by the current system that we allow on them today, or you could switch to autonomous vehicles and have the metaphorical one or much smaller set of people in the future. Okay, so I want to change our focus. I want to talk about more fundamental challenges that are specific to this technology. And in particular, the point I want to stress is that moral decision making really depends on adequate moral perception. One of the themes in my work on AI in general, but on autonomous vehicles in particular, is that we're insufficiently sensitive to the degree to which perception is a morally laden act. And avoidance of moral dilemmas is a core component of practical ethics, and it's also a core component of sound engineering. So I worry that too much of our discourse about artificial intelligence systems focuses on moral dilemmas, because that's where people see ethical issues arising. That's true, moral dilemmas surface ethical issues, but that's because you can't live up to all of your values. But a society in which there are a lot of moral dilemmas is itself a sick society. So if you've engineered your society to the point where there are a lot of moral dilemmas, then you've failed already. Ethics in ordinary life is a patchwork of values that enable seamless transactions between people. So nobody walked into this room and said, I want to sit in that seat, I'm going to punch you in the throat so that I can sit in that seat. No one said, you're already sitting in that seat, but I'm just going to sit on top of you. Right? There's an infinity of things that you didn't do that would have violated or transgressed some important norm, and your not doing them is what allows you and the thousands of other people in this building to interact in very complex but seamless ways and achieve the wide range of goals that get achieved in this building every day. So that's really part of the invisible but really fundamental role of ethics, and I want to try to surface the role of values in aspects of driving that we don't really think about. So my agenda is, I want to talk about what makes autonomous vehicles unique, what some of the challenges for regulating vehicles are, the problem with using the sort of fixed standards that we currently use to license vehicles today, and then I'll talk about, only in very broad strokes, a proposal that David and I have written about a proposal, a scheme for regulating autonomous vehicles that's closer to the way the FDA regulates drugs than the way that we currently regulate cars. So let's think about tasks. So a task is structured by values in three ways. There's a goal to achieve. So the goal that you want to achieve with a task is itself subject to moral evaluation. They're the means that you use to achieve those goals. They're subject to moral evaluation. And then there are constraints on both goals and means. Tasks can be nested in hierarchies. So usually lower level tasks are evaluated by their ability to contribute the inputs or achieve the work that's needed to hand off something to a higher level task. So you can automate tasks if they're discrete, if they are performed in a determinate context of operation. It doesn't have to be fixed, but the way that it varies has to be uniform and have very predictable signals. And there have to be clear performance criteria for success in operating in that context. So I made this slide, and it reflects my own inability to properly give you a three-dimensional figure. So what I want you to try to see is that the machine is on the plane. This is supposed to be a pyramid. So the machine is the plane that's sort of facing you. The task is the bottom of the pyramid. And when we're automating, when we're creating automated systems, the task, the structure of the task influences the designer, because the designer has to make a machine that's capable of performing that task. It influences the machine, because the machine has to be capable of performing that task, but it also has to be something that can be used by a user. So the designer has to think about the properties of the user and the properties of the task. So, yeah, so I just said that. There's a feature of user's relationship to the task, designer's relationship to the user, designer's relationship to the machine. So part of the discourse, people feel uncomfortable about machines making life and death decisions as though this is novel. But in fact, machines make life and death decisions for us all the time, because we've handed off to them tasks that we used to perform, but the seamlessness with which they perform those tasks is largely invisible to us. So, you know, do you remember what movie this is from? Hidden Figures, right? And so my favorite scene in that movie is when Katherine Johnson, on the left here, John Glenn is going to orbit the Earth, and he says, I want Katherine Johnson to calculate my re-entry trajectories. Don't use the computer. Now in the movie, these women were computers, right? I mean, there was a whole room full of women, and their job was to manually carry out a bunch of calculations. And at the same time, you know, there's this computer that they have in the background, and John Glenn trusts Katherine Johnson to make those calculations, not the machine. If you said today, I want a human to calculate my re-entry trajectory, not a machine, I'm fairly certain you'd be laughed out of the room. You might also have, say, backup redundancy, something like that, but machines do tons of our calculations for us. They simulate our bridges, they simulate our roads, you know, and life and death hinges on those decisions that they make, but it's kind of transparent to us. Another example in the driving space would be cruise control. So here it's a determinate context of operation for the machine, because the machine relies on the best context recognition system that we know of, namely the human driver, to activate the system, monitor the road to make sure the environment is such that the cruise control is still a permissible option. This is my van, so it's a dumb cruise control, so all it can do is maintain your speed, going uphill, you know, going downhill, and so on. So it's my job to make sure we don't get too close to other objects, to look, you know, oh, there's stopped traffic ahead, I need to disengage the cruise control, whatever. But nevertheless, it's driving the car, regulating the speed while I'm at the helm. Dynamic cruise control takes over more of the driving from the driver. Your car has proximity sensors, and so it can tell that it's approaching another car. It can slow its rate of speed. It can keep you in your lane if you're drifting out of your lane. There are systems that you can use if you're stopped in traffic and you want to look at your texts instead. You know, you activate that system. It'll maintain a fixed distance between you and the car in front of you. So you're offloading more of the driving onto that system, so you can have less of your attention on the road, but nevertheless, it's still a very fixed set of parameters on what the machine is doing. So these are determinate contexts of operations and systems that are interpretable. You can ask the engineer how those systems work. They can tell you how the circuitry works. If it runs a program, they can walk you through that program. It's all interpretable to the designer. What makes artificial intelligence different, and the systems that are, and components that are going to go into autonomous vehicles, at least of the kind we're contemplating now, is that they use approaches that are black boxes. So by interpretable here, I mean there's some model that maps the input stimulus conditions to the output response conditions that's explicit and that's encoded in a way that we can understand. And normally it's encoded that way because we create that model and we encode it in the system. Black box systems, the model is learned from statistical operations on a large array of data and encoded in a structure that we can't understand. We understand how that structure works, we understand how it comes to be, but you can't look at a convolutional neural network and say, ah, right, like I can tell you exactly what it's doing. Because very often the statistical comparisons that it's making are just too complex for you to walk through. So in medicine, it's kind of odd to be in the medical tower talking about cars. Usually I talk about these sorts of things, the medical applications, but FDA just approved the IDXDR system, which is a standalone system to diagnose diabetic, more than mild diabetic retinopathy. It will be implemented by technicians. It has sensitivity, specificity that's equivalent to the best experts, but it requires about an hour worth of training to implement in the clinic. It's inscrutable in the sense that you can't ask the system, why did you say that this person has more than mild diabetic retinopathy? It uses, so it takes as an input an image of a retina. There's a multi-layer convolutional neural network. In this particular system, the neural networks, it's a network of them that are looking at specific pathologies in the retina, specific exudates, lesions, and so on, in order to make a diagnosis of more than mild diabetic retinopathy or not. So you show it a retina, the first system tells you, yep, you can use it, this is sufficient quality. The next system tells you, yep, more than mild diabetic retinopathy, or nope, but that's it. You can't query the system for like, well, why did you think it was this way or not? So we've got two different types of systems, interpretable systems and inscrutable systems, but the interesting thing about these is that they work in determinate contexts of operation. I mean, the things about retinas, and I'm not a specialist here, but what I've read, is that we are pretty confident that they don't differ across racial groups, ethnicities, by region. So if you're looking for particular pathologies, those are what the expert would use. They would look at the image to get that information, and that's exactly what the expert system does. Indeterminate contexts of operation are very different. The proper task is context sensitive. The machine has to individuate the context from an indeterminate or a noisy background of possible sets of contexts. Then, once it's individuated what the context is, it has to select the act that it's going to perform, and it has to determine what constraints apply to the selection of that act. So let's think about driving now. So part of what you do when you drive is you navigate a physical space. There's lanes, roads, curbs, cars, pedestrians, and so on. And your challenge is just not to come into physical context with those other physical objects. If that's all that driving was, I think we'd be good. The problem is that driving is also navigating a social space, which is partly symbolic, because there is symbolic communication on the road. There's the frequent stuff that you see, stop signs, stop lights, yield sign, all signage. But think about exceptional cases. Someone's run off the road with a flat tire, or there's been an accident and someone is trying to signal you that there's a problem around the bend. There's an infinity of ways that they can signal caution to you, right? They can, because what do you have on you at the time? Maybe you, unlike our European colleagues, maybe you don't have a yellow vest that you have to carry in your car that signals danger. So you're waving your handkerchief, right? Or you're standing there like this, or you're putting your hands up, or there's all kinds of things that you would do to signal another driver of a problem. And then there's strategic interaction. So for me to go to work, I have to cross a bridge and go through a tunnel. And that means 4 lanes merge down to 2. And I can tell you that there is a zone right up close to the tunnel at which if you try to merge, the people in line will do whatever they can to harm you. Right? I mean, beyond that, you can get in, you might get a grimace, but in front of that, people are like, I'll run into you rather than let you in because it's just too close. It's just too flagrant. So that's one example. You have pedestrians on crosswalks. Am I going to go? Are you going to go? No, you go. It's okay, you go. Okay, I'm going to go. Don't walk. Cyclists and road rage, the interactions between cyclists and cars, very delicate. So the problem now in indeterminate context of operation is that you don't know what the structure of the task is, so you can't program or design your system around the structure of the task because the system itself has to figure out what the task is, see what its structure is, and react accordingly. So there's a lot more complexity now in this project. And autonomous vehicles are in this indeterminate context of operation, and at least some of their components are inscrutable. Because right now, the vision systems on all of these machines use some sort of neural network in order to identify objects. So now I'm going to just briefly, we can talk about this in discussion. You can hate me in discussion. I have a paper coming out in the Hastings Center report in the next issue where I defend this. So the position I'm about to give to you. There's a mantra in the AI world that says we have to have interpretable systems. So let's ask, is there an ethical problem with using a system that makes a decision when we can't understand the specific reasons for that decision? So this is, we're making like a sort of a differential diagnosis now. We're saying maybe part of the problem with everything on the bottom is that it's inscrutable. Maybe that's our worry. I don't think that that's the case. I'm just going to give you a glimpse into why. Part of the reason is that something like this. If you're so part of the reason that we use approaches that are inscrutable is that they're better. They're the most accurate solution we have to the problem. And in cases where we are operating in a fixed context of operation, part of the nice thing about these systems is that we can quantify their sensitivity and their specificity and their recall and so on. And in the medical context where you're seeing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or cases across a year, 1%, 2%, 3% difference in accuracy can mean a fair number of adverse events, missed medical cases, misdiagnoses, and so on. So I'm not sure how much we should be willing to trade. Same thing on the roads, right? The roads we drive, we have hundreds of thousands or millions of people driving tens of millions or hundreds of millions of miles on the road. So we've got big numbers. If we're going to be safe, we have to be ultra safe. We have to be like the NASDAQ, where there are billions of trades a day and only one or two get lost. So we're out to many decimal places of safety. So how many fatalities are you willing to trade for your ability to go, oh, I know why that happened. I know why that crash happened. That guy was checking his cell phone. If there are many fewer crashes, but you don't know why they happened specifically, or there are fewer misdiagnoses, but there are a few misdiagnoses and you don't know why they happened. Do you want to trade the knowledge of why they happened for more people who have misdiagnoses? We're really reluctant to use inscrutable systems, but I want to say, so this isn't a new problem, but I think it's really a problem. So this is a meta-analysis of 136 studies comparing mechanical prediction to human prediction. So these are not AI systems. They're the forerunner. They're the sort of dumb forerunners of AI systems. They are algorithms usually that were created with a simple regression. On an average, mechanical prediction is 10% more accurate than the human. 33 to 47% of mechanical predictions were substantially better. In only 6 to 16% of the studies was clinical prediction substantially more accurate. The range of conditions is pretty broad: cerebral impairment, psychiatric morbidity, and so on. And the point is, the authors of this say the trend in our data is so strong we conjecture the following: there's no selection of studies based on anything except study outcome itself that will yield a conclusion contrary to ours. That would be a bad design. That's why it's kind of egghead humor. So I'm worried in general that we like things that are scrutable because it helps us understand, but when what matters are the consequences, we should trade our ability to understand for better outcomes when we can verify that the outcomes are going to be better. That's a hill I'm willing to die on, and you can attack me in the Q&A if you'd like. that's really not what I wanted to focus on. What I want to focus on now is, I don't think that it's the inscrutability that's the problem with autonomous vehicles. It's the fact that right now we're asking them to work in very indeterminate contexts of operation. So let's think about what we do for driving. We license the driver. We say, here, we want to test your vision, we want to test your recall of the rules of the road, and then we want to take you out and see you perform rudimentary set of skills. Good, you are a very powerful context operation system, and you know the rules of the road. And then for your car, we have performance standards. So we say, here's the fixed context of operation in which the clutch, the engine, the transmission, the exhaust have to be able to perform. Any manufacturer who wants to manufacture those parts has to manufacture them to perform those functions within that part of the automobile, up to these tolerances and operations, and there are similar sorts of things for the whole car, but those are all just the manual operation of that system as it's going to be used by the human. How should we regulate autonomous vehicles, where now the car is doing all the things that the human used to do? We don't have very good answers, so for some of my colleagues in the room who may know more about the actual policies than I do, my apologies, this is kind of glib. Industry says we should require some number of accident-free miles, the problem with which is that if you drive the highway for 100 million miles, you're not seeing what it's like in neighborhoods with blind corners in the winter, in fog, in rain, in snow, where there are kids coming out of school and so on. Caltrans says include a human who can take control of the vehicle until it demonstrates something. The Department of Transportation says we should figure out a bunch of tests that the vehicle has to pass, but we're not quite sure what the tests are. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in approach and not just detail. So the problem is, now what we're asking the vehicle to do is to perform the task that the human used to do, so that means the vehicle has to perceive the world. It has to determine the context in which it's operating, it has to select the functions that it's going to perform and comply with relevant norms. Traditional standards for regulating vehicles presuppose a determinate context of operation, so we argue you can't use that approach with autonomous vehicles. You can for the vehicle itself, right? The clutch on an autonomous vehicle has to live up to the same performance standards as a clutch on a regular vehicle. But in terms of the car itself, you can't specify ex ante a fixed set of tolerances under which the vehicle needs to operate and then go out and have assurances that it's going to function safely on the road. So that's why I think there's a paradigm shift that has to happen in the way that we regulate vehicles. The traditional Department of Transportation approach is not going to work because we're not really evaluating the same object anymore. We're evaluating a new object, the thing that performs tasks that the old objects we were regulating didn't perform. So part of the worry here is autonomous vehicle perception. As I argued earlier, perception is itself morally laden. Autonomous vehicles perceive the world differently than we do, and it's only conditional on that perception that they can then carry out the tasks that they have to perform, namely finding an approximately optimal path through a landscape that they have to value, right? By that I just mean you want to know what's a shadow versus what's an object that I can't use. You can run through a shadow, but you can't run through a pedestrian or a bike or another car. So not only do you have to perceive the environment, but you have to be able to categorize it in terms of things you can run through and things you can't run through. So this is the way that the autonomous vehicle perceives the road. Here's the planning path through that sort of environment. The boxes that you see around objects represent the idea that the visual sensors have picked up that object. The classification system has said this is the space which that object requires, and so I have to keep a kind of minimal safe distance from that object. Okay, now, you and I, we value objects in context. So context makes sense to us, but it has no representation in an autonomous vehicle. So by context, I mean a situation in which our understanding of common goals or cues indicate that attention or choice is required to achieve a system goal or to conform to a norm. So if you're driving and you see a parked car with the door open, That's a context. You know that humans get in and out of cars with open doors. So you're going, where's the human? If you're driving through a neighborhood around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you're probably aware that there might be children. There's all kinds of background knowledge that you bring to the road that cues you to be sensitive to look for certain sorts of things. Autonomous vehicles don't have that. They recognize objects by pattern recognition, brute force pattern recognition, statistical operations on large sets of data so that they can say, this is what I think that kind of object is. So now these are slides from my colleague Phil Koopman and Mike Wagner. They have a company called EdgeCase Research. It's a spin-off from Carnegie Mellon, Mike's neighbor. Here they train up a convolutional neural network and then they put it through their system, which is called Hologram. And Hologram audits how well the neural network detects objects. So I don't know if you can see this, but on the left, what you have is a false negative and a false positive. The neural network sees the bicycle on the street and says, that's an object I need to avoid, that's a bike. It doesn't see the bicyclist riding ahead by the car, and so it says, that's an object I can drive through. Actually, they may not perceive it as an object, so that's part of space that I can drive through. A failure in moral perception like that will lead to inability to comply with the norms that we want on the road. In the middle picture, there's a pedestrian standing close to the pole, and so isn't identified because there's no clear outline of the pedestrian distinguishing it from the pole. On the right, identifying objects through time as they navigate through space is actually quite a difficult problem. And so if you have a pedestrian walking across the street, crossing in front of an object that obscures it from view, these are all with visual cameras. Different companies use different systems. LiDARs are very expensive. But they all have analogous problems with them. But in this case, if you lose track of the pedestrian, then for a moment now, the car thinks that's a part of space that it can drive through. And there's a bunch of these. This case reappears on this slide. So notice that on the left, if you don't see the construction worker, you also don't see the sign. Sorry, the slide has a timing. Also, here's the vehicle in the middle. What you can't see because of the red is that there's a woman who's about to get into it. And then on the right, there are two, I believe a male and a female figure who are recognized. There's a box around them, but the child is not recognized. Whereas you might think, well, as I'm driving, even just subconsciously, the neural network that's inside your brain might say, oh, if I see a man and a woman of a certain sort of age, I might want to be aware that there may be a child lingering around their knees somewhere. So image classifiers are highly sensitive to the quality of their inputs. There's been a lot of work on spoofing them, so can they recognize a street sign if you put various kinds of stickers on signs, so you can imagine hooligans who put stickers on signs. But you can get spoofing as a result of just degrading the conditions under which your sensor is perceiving the world. Fog, rain, snow, all those things can impede the ability of your image sensor to give you the sensitivity and recall that you were expecting under idealized conditions. So your success on the road now hinges on the adequacy of your perception relative to your goals, and the adequacy of your algorithms to identify objects and contexts relative to norms. So when you think about now, let's think about the trolley problem, right? People are saying, well, you've identified that there are a certain number of people over here, you've identified that there are a certain number of people over here, or the car somehow knows the number of passengers that are contained within it, and now it has to make a decision. Well, by that point, to get to that point, the car has to already perceive things that are beyond what we're talking about. That problem is getting a lot of attention when in fact it's sort of orthogonal to the main issues that we're dealing with in the development of this technology. Dumb cars are modular, so their parts can be swapped out without degrading performance. Autonomous vehicles performance is going to be a function of a complex interaction between a specific sensor array package, a specific image recognition system, and a specific planning and control system. So in our work on drug development, Jonathan Kimmelman and I talk about the notion of an ensemble. It's not just a piece of technology, it's the technology with knowing the windows within which you can deploy that technology safely, the windows for failure, indication, other parameters that go into the intelligent deployment of a system to get benefit out of it. Well, given that neural networks are trained on very specific inputs, there's no guarantee that if you make an alteration to the sensor package on your vehicle, that you are going to maintain the same quality of performance on that vehicle. So what you may need to do now is evaluate the whole vehicle, sensor package, programming, and everything. And a real question would be, as you push an update to your vehicle, how do you assure me that you've preserved its performance on everything you're happy with, you haven't degraded its performance on any of those things? Okay, so our proposal is that there is for a sort of a dynamic system of regulating autonomous vehicles, more like we do with drugs. So, you'd have a third-party trusted regulator that would be empowered to analyze all of the data that goes into the evaluation of these systems. You'd have a staged but non-linear regulatory process where there's exploratory testing in both simulation and in controlled environments where you're trying to develop a model of your system and how it works, what sorts of things it can detect, what its strengths and weaknesses are. We should be able to use that model to push the system beyond its boundaries so that we can break it. We should be able to contrive novel situations that we can put the system in order to test it, given your model of how it works. And we want to be able to validate its performance then through empirical testing and permutations of empirical testing. So I'll talk about that in a second. Basically, the goal is you owe us a model of your car that's based on data where we can see all of the data, where we can put your car through our own virtual environment, where we can put a child on every block that your car drives through, that we can put every car, so you'll give us the synthetic environment in which you drive, and we'll be able to put your car through that environment and through the environment of the other synthetic environments that other car makers are using to develop their car. But we need to know a typology of failure, design simulations so that when you say, hey, yep, we couldn't see that edge, we ran right into it, decapitated our driver, but we fixed it, then we need to be able to say, here's what that situation is, so that when we take your system through it tens of thousands of times, we know that we've taken it through that situation, because that typology is itself something that can be difficult to figure out. What was the cause of failure? So how do we know we've been through that system X number of times, that situation? A general observation is going to be much easier to demonstrate the safety and reliability of these vehicles in simpler environmental or use cases. So if you have a low-speed delivery van on a closed campus, you've just reduced the complexity of the task that it has to perform. At low speed, it's easier to identify people. You can rely on them to get out of the way. If it's a closed campus, you can educate the people around the vehicle about its abilities so that they aren't challenging the vehicle. Higher speed delivery van on a limited transport route with fencing. Okay, maybe it doesn't have to worry about deer jumping across the fence and going in front of it. You can imagine a delivery truck that has to go on the real highway to another waypoint. Maybe a human driver takes it to the highway. It navigates the highway. It's still going to have to deal with accidents, road construction, other things like that that it encounters on the highway. That's simpler than a taxi that's limited to unfenced but well-defined geographic area. We have Uber in Pittsburgh running there. We have like 7 or 8 autonomous car companies running their vehicles. You could put a dot in the middle of Pittsburgh, do a circumference, and you could say our vehicles have driven every inch of these roads in spring, summer, fall. They can't drive them at every time of day, with school getting out, not getting out, children on the road or not, but it's still simpler than a consumer vehicle that can take you from an arbitrary point in the world to an arbitrary point in the world. So my conclusion is that I'm less worried about interpretability than verifiability. Verifiability is easier to achieve for constrained autonomous vehicles. It's more difficult to achieve for vehicles that are operating in an open world. I think it's going to be likely that we're going to see a push from companies to simplify the environment so that their vehicles can function safely. I think this will raise just questions of distributive justice about the degree to which we're transferring public resources now to change the infrastructure so that private companies can make a profit. And I think that full autonomy is unlikely anytime soon. I don't mean it's never going to happen. I just think don't hold off buying a car because you're waiting to get one that's going to drive for you. This is some of the work that I've drawn on for the talk. I appreciate your patience and attention.
Thanks, Alex, for that. And while folks are thinking about questions or comments, I should acknowledge that we have some co-sponsors for today's talk, which are the Department of Health Policy and Management and the Center for Injury Research and Policy in the School of Public Health, and the Department of Civil Engineering in the Whiting School of Engineering. So we have relevant sponsors for what you just heard. All right, so with that, we need to have the microphone come to you so everybody can hear and so that the recording will capture you. Maybe you can introduce yourself very briefly so Alex knows who you are and everyone else in the room does too. Joe.
Hi, Joe Ali with the Berman Institute, School of Public Health International. Great talk. I have two quick questions. The first has to do with acceptance of variability and risk and safety profiles of vehicles and those sorts of things. And certainly today we have some degree of leeway in allowing certain vehicles to be on the road even though they may not meet. I have a 71 Chevy, for example, that brakes lock up every time I touch them, and it's sort of on the road and it's fine. And so what level of, when you think about autonomous vehicles, what level of variability in designing against risk and how you just kind of elaborate features? You can imagine people are always competing for safety standards and those sorts of things, so that's going to continue, but what's the range of sort of, how would one even conceive of that in the context of your work? And then the second has to do with, I guess it's curious to me that when we think about the way you framed it is that, the kinds of perceptive activities that humans do and teasing out the determinate from the indeterminate in the social context that we're aware of, and we have more than one perception, more than one sense, so we're able to perceive these things more effectively, etc. Yet we hold ourselves to this really low standard bar, right? We put people out there, it's having licenses after going through discrete tests and vision exams, and that's it. We don't really say, how good are you at teasing out social context when you're driving, and figure out ways to measure that, So why do we have to do it in this context? How is it different?
Yeah, so for your first question, I think this question of variability is very much an open question right now. There are people that, there are manufacturers that really want to have a minimal sensor array package on their vehicles. And then there are others who say, look, if you have a LiDAR on the top of your vehicle, this is a 16 beam or 32 beam, whatever, laser that spins in 360 degrees. You've got proximity sensors, you have a sonar and a radar, then you can look at the maps of what these vehicles can perceive, and they have very good perception. You have to integrate all of these things because you might get a camera that gives you a false positive, and the LiDAR says there's nothing there, and then there's you have to reconcile now what the decision theory is of taking these two different signals and figuring out which one is right within your system. But nevertheless, the more sensors you have, the better you're going to be at perceiving. But now, a LiDAR can be $100,000. I mean, there are simpler ones, smaller ones, that are getting down into the $1,000 range. But cars are already expensive, and so I think the promise of using very simple sensors on cars that are going to function autonomously is very risky. Now, in terms of variability, yeah, what we're really bad at, and I think the people who have been popularizing these discussions, partly what they're really bad at, is getting you what the right contrast class is. The contrast class to an autonomous vehicle is not perfection. The contrast class is the way humans drive, and human systems are really bad on the road. They drive distracted, they drive drunk, they do all kinds of things that are problems. So now, what should the standard be? I think if your system was only as good as human drivers, But if you could cut the road deaths in half, I think that'd be great. You know.
Hi, Alex. This is Travis Reeder, faculty at Berman Institute, and I think I want to ask you about autonomy generalized as opposed to the specific case of autonomous vehicles. And so I found your general idea very compelling that when you're comparing, you know, a death toll of 30,000+ people a year, we might give up scrutability for trade-off in significantly reducing those deaths. And what we might do is we might just kind of very explicitly say, like, we're making a higher level decision to enact Plan A that's going to reduce, even if we can't understand it. What I wanted to hear your thoughts on is whether you think that's just a feature of the context of vehicles, where you're doing hundreds of millions of miles and the death toll is so high. Because while I can understand that argument for vehicles, for this public health reason, I don't think I want an elder care robot helping my mom if that robot's inscrutable, right? So the context seems to matter a whole lot. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on this, whether you think your argument in the one context is supposed to transfer over, just kind of hear you think a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think for me, one of my problems with the literature is that we lump too many things together. So if you think about the grid, right, already with inscrutable and inscrutable and determinate and indeterminate now at least we have 3 different cases that we can talk about. And when you tell me, well, think about an elder care robot, what I want to know is what kind of elder care robot now? Is it something that's performing a very limited set of tasks? We have robots in our hospitals that carry the prescriptions from room to room, right? Those are not like BB-8, right? Or are you talking about something that's supposed to have a social interaction, be a companion for your loved one? Then I think the more open-ended of a world that you put the robot in, then the more challenges that you're going to have in terms of its ability to navigate a symbolic social world. So I think what you're more likely to see, I think you do have some of the same things in medicine. Diabetic retinopathy is a really low piece of low-hanging fruit, and as would be some other imaging cases, to the extent that, so if you diagnose if you grade the cancer of cells just from the image of the slide, that's the sort of thing a convolutional neural network can do. If you do mammography where you're comparing the patient's history, their healthy breasts, their unhealthy, the one where there's concern for pathology, to their, over time, their history, medical history, other things like that, that's not the sort of thing we have systems that are really good at, combining these multimodal databases. So, and also you've got a bunch of people out there who are talking their book, as we'd say in finance, which means they're just trying to sell you their product. So they want to avoid regulatory hurdles, and they want to convince you that what they have is magic. My whole thing is I'm all for the use of this technology so long as we subject it to the same kind of empirical scrutiny that we do other medical devices and interventions. Because you need tight quality control on these things to assure that they work. The benefits of them is your ability to quantify the extent to which they work, and then try to have a ratchet effect, right? Improve them in the future. We are where we are because of 3 things: advances in computational power, the availability of large databases of medical information, and advances in machine learning. Computational power will continue to increase, availability of medical data will grow, and advances in machine learning will continue. And so then that means our ability to take where we are now and bootstrap ourselves up. I think that's something we should try to leverage and work for, but that means we have to be very sensible about the cases in which this is a feasible approach to a problem, and cases where it just isn't. I don't like the use of these things for giving loans or for hiring. Because in these cases, you have a database of information that tells you this is a positive, this is a negative. We don't know what a good employee is. There's no database of good employee, bad employee to train that up, right? It's sort of just prognosticating. Let's have it look at things and make a forecast. And that kind of fishing expedition, I'm really not a big fan of. So that's why, were I a developer in this space, I would really want to distinguish a case where there's a ground truth and I'm using complex statistical processes to try to track that ground truth, even if there's a way that we do it in a way we don't currently understand, from something where we don't know what the ground truth is and we're trying to learn that at the same time as we make a decision.
Hi, Justin Bernstein. I'm a Heck Levy postdoctoral fellow at the Berman Institute. So I wanted to ask about sort of the flip side of the contextual knowledge that humans have. So you might think that there's certain kinds of conventions that we've settled on that let us interpret each other really well, but there are others that are really bad. So you mentioned one of them, so like, you know, that sort of choke point in the merge on your daily commute. We might think, you know, people will expect that of one another. In some cases, if I were to go to your community, I wouldn't expect that. It'd be really bad. We might think that the absence of contextual knowledge like this in certain cases, the absence of these sorts of conventions might be a good thing. And then I might ask, to what extent do we think that, you know, our conventions about, or sort of what we bring to the table in terms of contextual knowledge, how helpful is it compared to what we would bring to the table if we were just to have AI or something like that?
Yeah, so Pittsburgh is a place where there are a lot of conventions of the road. So we have the Pittsburgh left. So if you are at a stoplight and you're the first person and you want to turn left, then when the light turns green, you could go. And the other person might be more yielding to that than not. And I've seen situations where the person is waiting for the person in the front to do a Pittsburgh left, and that person isn't going to do a Pittsburgh left, and the light turns green, and they're like, go! You know, what are you doing? You're messing it all up. The guy's like, but it's a green light. So those things can be a problem, right? But I think there's just the background degree to which we use context recognition goes beyond things like practices on rules of the road, right? You know, like I will look at you and know whether you're going to let me in a merge or not, right? Or I will look at you and know whether you've seen me when you're crossing the street or whether you might be listening to your headphones and looking the other way. If you're driving down the road and you have your blinker on and you come across a place where you might turn and you don't, then I say, like, just, you know, unconsciously, this person's lost or they don't know where they're going, or they had their blinker on and don't realize it, right? Like, I have a hypothesis now over a space, and then, you know, I may test that when you come to the next place and be like, oh, you didn't turn again. Yeah, you know, you're not slowing down. You just don't realize you have your blinker on, right? And I'll adjust my driving that way. So there's tons of background information that we use to simplify the process of driving on the road. And really what it leverages is our knowledge of your goals. Like, you're driving to achieve something. You're going somewhere. You're doing something. You could be a Sunday drive. I don't want to be behind you then. You know, you're a service vehicle, and so you're going to make frequent stops. Like, there's all kinds of things where we know, this is your goal. This is how I can predict the way you're going to drive. Right now, our vehicle systems don't have anything like that. It's all just pattern matching and predicting your behavior from your behavior 10 seconds ago.
Hi, Casey Humberton, Associate Faculty of the Berman. But I'm also an orthopedic surgeon, so a lot of the things that you discussed was like it's a lot more complex when you're driving in a city or in a suburb. And I'm Googling now and not succeeding at knowing how many of the deaths occur on highways, because it certainly seems that when I'm on call, the people who are the most broken near death are high energy fatalities. So is there a middle road of we can make it smart enough for highways and that it automatically does that? You know, that's where I'm most terrified driving, just based on what I see is the person using texting on the highway, whereas in Baltimore City, my brain's always like, well, they're not at a lethal speed, even though they're doing really dumb things. It doesn't solve the pedestrians, it doesn't solve the bicyclists. But is there a process of thinking about it just autonomous on highway only, where it's a little more regimented?
I think for consumer vehicles, not so much. But for freight, long-haul trucking, I think that's the idea that people would see, you know, is that if we can have depots that are close to highways. Highways are already relatively highly controlled. You know, we fence them. You don't see many pedestrians on them. Now, I was at a meeting I was just at in Japan. There was a fellow from Texas A&M who talked about a very different approach to autonomy. It's actually, I'm not sure you'd even call it autonomy, where instead of loading all these sensors into your vehicle and asking every vehicle to independently perceive the world around it, you line the road with cameras from above and sensors, and you send that telemetry to your vehicle, and when you come to, say, like a turnpike area, it says, look, do you want to drive this autonomously? If yes, press yes and pay a fee to use the infrastructure. And you could easily do this on like a turnpike sort of situation. With the car you have now, you just need a little cellular connection to the infrastructure. And you've offloaded now, so now the whole road would perceive where the other cars are, what other animals are, and it would drive you that way. It's a very different approach to what, from your standpoint, would look like autonomy. Maybe computationally more tractable. So I think probably what you will see will be highway vehicles first. But I'm not a futurist, and nor am I a developer. So.
What percentage of the deaths are highway first? I can't say. No idea.
One more? Perfect. Actually, this is going to be a perfect ending. You're going to get somebody who works in this area.
Yeah.
My name is Taddy Musa. I'm a professor of civil engineering. Really like to talk. So at Hopkins, we're working on issues related to disparities and how autonomous vehicles might address it. And I think there's great opportunity for that. But just to put in, we can talk about this for a whole hour. But I'll just talk about one thing, and that's equipoise. So suppose we have autonomous vehicles and we want them to, say, serve low-income neighborhoods, to bring people to health services, or bring them to groceries because there's food desert and so on. Then in order for that to happen, then you expose them to the risks of the autonomous vehicles. But then there's this, if you look at it, you talked about drug trial, the drug kind of format. So equipoise is relevant here, would be relevant here. So could you say something about equipoise? So we're offering services to help address disparities, and but there's risks, but maybe it's worth it because of the if you look at it from a point of view of equipoise, maybe it's worth the risk for these neighborhoods.
So I'm not sure. So thank you just for asking a question about equipoise, because that's like my other hobby horse. Yeah, it's my other favorite thing. But sadly, I don't think I'm not sure that concept has that much to say about this. What I would say is, so I'm very much a fan of the push to develop this technology to help reduce disparities. My worry is about the degree to which we'll need to change the economic environment in order to make that happen, because there aren't going to be private firms, or at least the firms that we see in this space right now, move towards catering to people who have disposable income and less towards ameliorating social disparity. So that means I think we're going to have to be wary of the degree to which we rely on market forces as opposed to subsidizing or other, like putting money in to create a context in which entrepreneurs would want to act in this space. But yeah, I think slow-speed grocery delivery vans are likely to be, especially if the idea is you say, look, I've got this car, it travels from our warehouse to these specific neighborhoods. It will take route A, B, and C, and it travels at 25 miles an hour. So I can tell you the sensor package that it has, and I can tell you we've driven those routes 10,000 times, and we can simulate the driving of that route millions of times, and we can put kids here, we can do all sorts of things like that, and we're only driving 25 miles an hour, then I think we would get to the point where we're not sure that we'd have to make a trade-off for safety. We'd be able to say something like, there's a threshold of safety that we've met where you should allow us to have this vehicle on the road. In Pittsburgh, I think that would be a different proposition because we're an old place with narrow roads. If you are in like Kansas City or something like that, or where was I just? Someplace in California where it was like I couldn't even make it across the road before the lights changed because it was like a football field, just like to cross the road. Yeah, you've got a ton of extra space. You could say, here's a little tiny lane, for autonomous vehicles, and it's like, well, now you've reduced even further. They don't even have to navigate traffic. So, and I think those are the sorts of things that we're likely to see. Bike lanes, except for autonomous vehicles that perform local tasks. And I think it would be great. I'd be happy to have my tax dollars subsidize vehicles like that if they're helping to eliminate food deserts, as opposed to if it's helping to take tech workers from their suburban homes into their urban offices so that they can avoid paying taxes in the city.
All right, to be continued. Thank you so much for doing this. you all for attending. Our next seminar is April the 8th in this room, Brian Carter on pediatric. See you then.